The rivalry between Marvel and DC is one of the oldest in the history of humanity. You and I weren't even born yet when their rivalry began. But there are certain moments in which it seems that their rivalry turns into admiration, because as I've already shown in 2 other videos and will show in this one, Marvel and DC draw inspiration from each other to create their characters. Sometimes they even draw too much inspiration from each other. And since you've been asking for it so much, as the considerate person that I am finally providing the 3rd part of the biggest Marvel and DC copycat series, just for you. Let's go. Bumblebee. This one is a bit strange because, the character that inspired the creation of Bumblebee certainly has its relevance and popularity. But in my humble opinion, she's not a character so popular and amazing that should inspire someone to copy her. Bumblebee, also known as Karen Beecher, first appeared in DC Comics in 1977. She gained her powers through a suit she developed to emulate the Atom. Bumblebee has the ability to shrink to the size of a bee and shoot energy blasts. Does this remind you of someone? You can't go wrong with this one. She's an obvious copycat of the Wasp. They both have exactly the same powers and abilities. The only thing that changes is the insect they represent. Fun fact, the bee is an insect that is part of the order Hymenoptera, just like wasps. So, they are even part of the same order of insects. Wasp is a founding member of the Avengers in Marvel Comics and debuted in 1963. She gained her powers through exposure to Pym particles developed by Dr. Hank Pym, aka Ant-Man. Wasp can shrink in size, fly, and shoot bioelectric energy blasts. So, 13 years after Wasp's debut in comics, Bumblebee makes her debut. And to make Bumblebee a bit more different, they decided that Bumblebee would be their first black female superhero. While their origins, character development, and roles within their respective teams are unique, their similarities are undeniable. There's no way Bumblebee is not at least a bit inspired by Wasp. Final verdict. She is a failure as a copycat. Moon Knight. I think by the name, you probably have a certain character in mind. If his name were White Knight, there wouldn't even be any doubts. Many may disagree, but for me, it's hard not to think that Moon Knight was completely inspired by Batman. Sure, they might have some unique backgrounds, motivations, and storylines. But Moon Knight and Batman share certain similarities that it's impossible not to think about Moon Knight as a copycat of Batman. They both have similar personas and are vigilante crime fighters. Both characters operate at night, wear costumes that incorporate elements of darkness, and use gadgets and detective skills to fight crime. Moon Knight, created by Doug Moench and Don Perlin, debuted in 1975. Batman, created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, first appeared in DC Comics in 1939. There's no doubt about who copied whom, but I must say, this doesn't take away from Moon Knight's merit. Just because he's heavily inspired by Batman doesn't suddenly devalue his stories. Moon Knight indeed has incredible stories that differ greatly from Batman's, but the similarities between the 2 characters are undeniable. However, in this case, we can consider Moon Knight a successful copycat because he does have great stories, and despite not being as popular as Batman, he is fairly popular. So, final verdict, successful copycat. Black Cat. She is a skilled burglar and occasional ally/foe of a superhero. She possesses no superhuman abilities, but is a master thief and hand-to-hand combatant. Her costume often features black leather and a white fur-trimmed mask, similar to a cat's markings. You might be wondering, wait, isn't this the description of Catwoman? Well, almost. Catwoman also operates as both a thief and an occasional vigilante. Like Black Cat, she is a skilled burglar and martial artist, often depicted wearing a catsuit and using a bullwhip as her weapon of choice. And they're both beautiful women. Well, that doesn't really count. But I think it's very clear that Black Cat has too many similarities with Catwoman. Black Cat made her first appearance in Marvel Comics in The Amazing Spider-Man number 194, published in July 1979. Catwoman first appeared in DC Comics in Batman number 1, which was published in spring 1940. Fun fact, Anne Hathaway, aka Catwoman, was cast to play Black Cat in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 4. As we all know, the movie got cancelled, but it seems like the role of portraying a Catwoman was destined for her. Final verdict, Black Cat is definitely a failure as a copycat. Mr. Fantastic. This is one of those cases where the copy became way more popular than the original. I think I can say with certainty that when someone mentions the name Rubberman, you probably think of Mr. Fantastic. And I know, you were not expecting this one. It's even weird to think about Mr. Fantastic as a copycat, but it's true. Mr. Fantastic is a copycat of Plastic Man. Mr. Fantastic debuted in the Fantastic Four, number 1 in November 1961. He gained his stretching abilities after being exposed to cosmic rays during a scientific space mission. Plastic Man gained his stretching powers after being exposed to a mysterious substance. Plastic Man, created by Jack Cole, first appeared in Police Comics number 1 in August 1941. They both have superhuman elasticity and both can change their body forms. Personality-wise, they are indeed different. Unlike Mr. Fantastic, Plastic Man has a more lighthearted and comedic personality, often using his abilities for playful and humorous purposes. And in case you were thinking that Mr. Fantastic shouldn't be on the list because Police Comics is not DC, you are wrong. Police Comics was a title published by Quality Comics, which was later acquired by DC Comics. So yes, his stories belong to DC, but I get it. It's weird to think about Mr. Fantastic as a copy of another character because honestly, when I think about a character that can stretch his body a lot, I think about Mr. Fantastic. Final verdict. Despite Mr. Fantastic being a blatant copy, he achieved much more success than Plastic Man. No one can deny that. So he definitely deserves to be classified as a super successful copycat. Power Princess. DC Comics went through a phase where they lacked female characters. Writers initially focused more on writing male characters, and consequently, female characters were left aside. And because of that, there was a great lack of female characters with depth and with stories as good as the stories of male characters. Until DC finally introduced the female character who would be one of the best, if not the best female character in comic book history, Wonder Woman. And obviously, the success that Wonder Woman achieved was undeniable. So Marvel once again felt the need to have a female character like Wonder Woman. But as always, they couldn't just do copy and paste. Their character had to have their differences. Their first try was Lady Sif. Lady Sif is an Asgardian warrior who for a long time was even Thor's romantic partner. Coincidentally, the ship that fans like the most is Wonder Woman with Superman. Interestingly, Thor's main rival in DC. Lady Sif is also based on mythology, just like Wonder Woman. While Wonder Woman is based on Greek mythology, Lady Sif is based on Norse mythology. And she also looks really similar to Wonder Woman. But Lady Sif wasn't even Marvel's most blatant attempt to copy Wonder Woman because in 1982, the Power Princess made her debut in Marvel Comics. After Lady Sif's failure as a copycat, they thought the only way to make their version of Princess Diana successful was to make her as similar as possible. And in this case, her similarities with Princess Diana are truly undeniable. But their physical resemblances, their powers, abilities, and the fact that both characters were born on an island isolated from the rest of the world, and both fought in World War II, leaves no doubt that the Power Princess is a copycat of Wonder Woman, considering Wonder Woman made her debut in 1941, almost 40 years before Power Princess debut in Marvel. Final verdict. Despite their similarities, in terms of popularity and success, they're not even close. So obviously, the Princess of Power is a failure as a copycat. Squadron Supreme. The Squadron Supreme is Marvel's demonstration of admiration for DC. By the name you might think that the Squadron Supreme is a copy of the Suicide Squad. But no. The Squadron Supreme doesn't even seem like a blatant copy of the Justice League, but rather a homage. Especially because Marvel didn't need to make a copy of the Justice League, as they already have the Avengers. But their similarities are undeniable. Contrary to what many think, the Sentry wasn't Marvel's first copy of Superman. The first was indeed Hyperion of the Squadron Supreme. Then there is Nighthawk. Nighthawk is a billionaire without powers who wears a suit to fight evil. Similar to Batman. I don't know if you remember a certain character that I mentioned a few minutes ago. A certain princess called Power Princess. That's right, she is part of the Squadron Supreme. As you already know, the Power Princess grew up on an island isolated from the rest of the world and fought in World War II. Just like Princess Diana. And we also have Dr. Spectrum, who uses a prism to create solid light structures that he obtained from an alien. Just like Ryan Reynolds. Jordan. And obviously, if they're copying the Justice League, they couldn't miss having their own version of the Flash. In this case, it's Whizzer. It would be funny if one day they made a movie of the Squadron Supreme versus the Justice League. Or maybe not. The Justice League would probably win easily. But you never know. Final verdict. Despite the Squadron Supreme seeming like a Marvel homage to the Justice League, they're still a failure as a copycat. Their success doesn't even come close to the success that Justice League had and has. Blue Beetle. Just like Superman, Spider-Man has also been a target of many attempts to be copied. And after failed copies like Black Spider, DC had to try again. And the case of Blue Beetle was even more bizarre, because Blue Beetle existed way before Spider-Man. He's literally one of the oldest superheroes in the comic book industry. But after Spider-Man became a huge success, DC decided to gradually change the Blue Beetle character to become more and more similar to the friendly neighborhood hero. Blue Beetle was created in 1939, 24 years before Spider-Man. But Blue Beetle has been interpreted by 3 different people throughout his history: Dan Garrett, Ted Kord, and Jamie Reyes. The first version of him, Dan Garrett, really had no resemblance to Spider-Man. But since Ted Kord, some changes were made to the character, and fans noticed right away that the character was starting to have some similarities with Spider-Man. And then with his third version, Jamie Reyes, the similarities became even more obvious. The character became a very intelligent teenager who fights against evil. And just like Black Spider, he also likes to do some poses similar to Spider-Man poses. Many even say that Stan Lee was actually inspired by the first version of Blue Beetle to draw and write Peter Parker. I honestly don't believe that's true. I'm not saying that's impossible, but honestly, I don't see any similarities between the two characters, except that they both wear superhero suits. Final verdict. I am not going to say that he is a complete failure as a copycat, but he is definitely not on Spider-Man's level. So, yes, I consider him a failure as a copycat. Super Adaptoid. The premise of the Super Adaptoid is to be a villain who copies the powers of an entire team of superheroes. In his case, the Avengers. Does that remind you of someone? If you read comics, you probably already know who I'm talking about. If you don't read comics, let me introduce you to Amazo. Amazo is an android created through nanotechnology, and his main ability is to copy all the powers of superheroes. In Amazo's case, he was used to copy the powers of the members of the Justice League. I think this is enough to explain why Super Adaptoid is on this list. Both characters are artificially created beings, often by villainous organizations or individuals seeking to harness the powers of superheroes. The difference between them is their debut date. Super Adaptoid made his debut in 1966, while Amazo debuted in 1960. Final verdict. Despite everything, Amazo is way more relevant to DC than Super Adaptoid is to Marvel. So, he is definitely a failure as a copycat. Now, I want you to do the same thing. Rank the characters I showed in the video as successful copycats or as failures in the comments, just to see if our opinions match. I know it took me a bit of time to release the third part, but it's finally here. I hope the wait was worth it. If you haven't seen the other parts, click on this video. This is the first part of this series. I really hope to see you there.